Right now, as you're listening to this, there's a competition unfolding that will determine which nations lead the world economy for the next 50 years. It's not about oil, it's not about gold, it's about materials you've probably never heard of, with names like dysprosium, terbium, and neodymium. These are rare earth elements, and they're part of a broader category called critical minerals. If you think this sounds like something distant from your daily life, think again. The smartphone in your pocket, the electric vehicle charging in your neighbor's driveway, the wind turbine generating clean energy, the fighter jet protecting national airspace, none of these exist without critical minerals. And here's what should concern every one of us. One country controls most of the world's supply. China holds approximately 70% of global rare earth mining, 85% of refining capacity, and about 90% of magnet manufacturing. This isn't just an economic issue. This is about the future of technology, the security of nations, and the stability of global supply chains that touch every aspect of modern life. Let's talk about what critical minerals actually are and why they matter so profoundly. Critical minerals are materials deemed essential to economic or national security, with supply chains vulnerable to disruption. The United States currently tracks 50 different critical minerals. For 12 of these, America relies entirely on imports. For another 29, the country imports at least half of what it needs. These aren't obscure materials used in niche applications. Critical minerals are the foundation of the technologies defining the 21st century. Lithium, cobalt, and graphite power the batteries in electric vehicles and energy storage systems. Rare earth elements create the permanent magnets essential for electric motors, wind turbines, and countless industrial applications. An average 100-kilowatt electric vehicle motor contains roughly 5 kilograms of neodymium praseodymium and about 1 kilogram of dysprosium oxide. But the applications extend far beyond clean energy. These materials are critical for defense systems, precision-guided missiles, advanced radar, military communications equipment. They're essential for consumer electronics, every smartphone, laptop, and tablet. They're vital for medical devices, aerospace technology, and artificial intelligence infrastructure. As AI, robotics, and autonomous systems transform our economies, the demand for these materials will only intensify. Here's the sobering reality. By 2035, China is projected to supply over 60% of refined lithium and cobalt, around 80% of battery-grade graphite and rare earth elements, and approximately 70% of battery-grade manganese. This isn't just market dominance. This is near monopoly control over the materials powering modern civilization. This isn't just an economic issue. This is about the future of technology, the security of nations, and the stability of global supply chains that touch every aspect of modern life. Understanding this crisis requires understanding how we arrived at this point. It wasn't always this way. Decades ago, the United States was a leader in rare earth production. But over time, a combination of factors shifted production overseas. Environmental regulations made mining and processing more expensive domestically. The mining and refining processes are resource-intensive and can be heavily polluting, particularly for rare earths, which require complex separation processes that are technically challenging and capital-intensive. China recognized the strategic value of these materials early and invested heavily in building integrated supply chains, from mining to processing to manufacturing. While other nations focused on finished products, China built the foundation. The country didn't just extract raw materials. It developed the refining and processing capabilities that are often more valuable than the mines themselves. This created a strategic vulnerability that most nations didn't fully appreciate until recently. When you control the processing and refining, you control access to these materials regardless of where they're mined. China currently processes approximately 85 to 90% of global rare earths, even though significant deposits exist in other countries. The wake-up call came when China began using this dominance as geopolitical leverage. In 2025, China imposed rigorous export controls on heavy rare earth elements. In April of that year, controls were widened to include alloys containing lutetium, yttrium, dysprosium, and terbium, as well as certain high-end magnets. Then in October, China expanded these controls further to include additional elements like holmium, erbium, thulium, and ytterbium. These weren't just commercial decisions. They were calculated moves framed as national security measures, adding regulatory friction to supply chains, underpinning electric vehicles, defense systems, clean energy, and advanced manufacturing. This is about the future of technology, the security of nations, and the stability of global supply chains that touch every aspect of modern life. Let's ground this in concrete examples of what this competition means in practice. In 2025, China's expanded export controls on rare earths caused immediate production delays and shutdowns for automobile manufacturers in Europe and the United States. Companies that had spent years developing electric vehicle platforms suddenly faced uncertainty about accessing the materials needed to build motors. This wasn't a hypothetical risk. It was assembly lines stopping, workers being sent home, and delivery schedules being pushed back. In January 2026, China curbed rare earth exports to Japanese companies following remarks by Japan's prime minister regarding Taiwan. This demonstrated how critical mineral access could vanish based on political statements, not market dynamics. Several U.S. manufacturers reliant on rare earth-based magnets cited ongoing uncertainty about the stability of supply as the root cause of persistently weak orders, even during periods of strong demand. The semiconductor industry faced similar disruptions. Advanced chips require numerous critical minerals, and any interruption in supply ripples through the entire technology sector. When you can't get the materials, you can't make the chips. When you can't make the chips, you can't build the devices that run on them. The interconnection is total. Defense contractors began raising alarms about national security implications. Modern military systems, from fighter jets to missile defense systems to naval vessels, depend heavily on rare earth magnets and other critical minerals. The prospect of adversaries controlling access to materials essential for national defense was no longer a theoretical concern. In late October 2025, a temporary trade agreement between the United States and China suspended some export controls for 1 year, ending in November 2026. But this agreement itself exemplifies the instability. Industries breathed a sigh of relief, but everyone understood this was a temporary reprieve, not a permanent solution. The fundamental vulnerability remained. The world is responding, but the challenge is enormous and the timeline is urgent. The United States has made critical minerals a top priority. In early February 2026, the Trump administration hosted representatives from 54 countries at the Critical Minerals Ministerial in Washington. Vice President J.D. Vance proposed creating a new critical mineral trading bloc among allies, a strategic framework designed to ensure member nations have reliable access to these materials regardless of global market disruptions. On February 3, 2026, President Trump announced Project Vault, a landmark initiative that combines nearly $2 billion of private capital with a $10 billion loan from the U.S. Export-Import Bank. This represents America's first strategic minerals reserve for industry, a buffer to shield domestic manufacturers from supply shocks while expanding U.S. production and processing of critical raw materials. The scale of investment is unprecedented. The U.S. Department of Energy has announced funding totaling hundreds of millions of dollars to advance mining, processing, and recycling technologies. The Department of Defense committed up to $1 billion to procure stockpile materials. Numerous bilateral agreements have been signed with Australia, Japan, Saudi Arabia, and multiple countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Europe is pursuing parallel strategies. The European Union has selected 60 strategic projects targeting lithium, graphite, cobalt, nickel, and rare earths, with growing emphasis on processing capacity. Of these projects, 47 are located within the EU and 13 are external, partnering with countries including Canada, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Zambia. But here's the difficult truth. While this investment is welcome and overdue, the capacity required won't be created overnight. Processing and refining remain the significant bottlenecks in the global critical minerals supply chain. Rare earths in particular require highly complex separation processes that are technically challenging and capital intensive. Building sovereign refining capabilities requires multi-year, potentially multi-decade investment. The numbers illustrate the challenge. Even with aggressive development, there will not be enough new capacity at new facilities to replace the position Chinese companies currently hold in the mineral market. Western nations are racing to reduce dependence from 70–90% to perhaps 40–50% over the next decade. That's progress, but it still leaves enormous exposure. There's a common misconception that if countries just opened more mines, the problem would be solved. The reality is far more complex. Mining is only the first step. The ore that comes out of the ground isn't usable in its raw form. It must go through intensive refining and processing to separate the valuable elements from the surrounding rock. For rare earths, this process is particularly challenging because these elements often occur together and have similar chemical properties, making separation technically demanding. The processing stage is also where environmental concerns are most acute. The chemicals required, the energy consumed, and the waste generated make this a challenging undertaking. This is part of why so much processing moved to China. Environmental regulations were less stringent, and the country was willing to accept the environmental costs that came with becoming the global processor. Recycling represents another potential avenue for supply. Electronic waste contains substantial quantities of valuable rare earths and other critical minerals. But here, too, China has built significant advantages. The complex separation and extraction processes required for recycling are technically similar to primary processing, and China leads in these capabilities as well. Even the geographic distribution of resources creates challenges. While critical mineral deposits exist in many countries, they're often concentrated in politically unstable regions or in locations where mining would face significant opposition. The largest cobalt reserves are in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where mining operations have faced criticism over labor practices and conflict financing. Balancing the need for these materials with ethical sourcing requirements adds another layer of complexity. There's also the time factor. Building a mine from discovery to production typically takes 10 to 15 years when you account for exploration, permitting, environmental reviews, financing, construction, and ramp-up. Building processing facilities requires similar timescales. The strategic mineral projects announced in 2026 won't reach full capacity until the 2030s at the earliest. The competition over critical minerals is fundamentally reshaping geopolitics and will continue to define international relations for decades to come. We're witnessing the emergence of new strategic alliances built not around traditional military partnerships, but around resource security. Countries are evaluating their international relationships through the lens of mineral access. The U.S.-Australia Critical Minerals Framework, agreements with Saudi Arabia on rare earths refining, partnerships across Southeast Asia, these represent a reconfiguration of economic and strategic relationships. For producer countries, nations with significant critical mineral deposits, this competition creates both opportunities and risks. On one hand, they have leverage to negotiate favorable terms, secure technology transfer, demand value addition through domestic processing, and attract substantial investment. On the other hand, they risk becoming pawns in great power competition, facing pressure to align with one bloc or another, and potentially experiencing economic coercion. The competition is also driving innovation. Companies are investing heavily in alternative materials that could reduce dependence on the most constrained critical minerals. Researchers are developing new battery chemistries that require less cobalt or eliminate it entirely. Manufacturers are designing motors that use different rare earth combinations or reduce rare earth content. These innovations won't eliminate the need for critical minerals, but they could reduce pressure on the most constrained supplies. However, demand is growing faster than these solutions can be implemented. The global electric vehicle fleet is projected to grow from millions to hundreds of millions of vehicles over the next 2 decades. Renewable energy installations are accelerating. Data centers supporting artificial intelligence and cloud computing are multiplying. Each of these trends increases demand for critical minerals. Climate policy and industrial policy are now inseparable from critical mineral policy. Countries can't achieve their clean energy goals without securing access to the materials that make clean energy technologies possible. This creates uncomfortable trade-offs. Do you proceed more slowly with clean energy transitions to avoid deepening dependence on concentrated supply chains? Or do you accept greater geopolitical risk in exchange for faster progress on climate goals? The critical minerals competition is not a future concern. It's happening right now, and the decisions made in the next few years will shape economic and strategic outcomes for the next half-century. This is fundamentally about whether the technologies defining modern life will be accessible, affordable, and secure. It's about whether nations can defend themselves, whether industries can manufacture their products, whether consumers can access the technologies they've come to depend on. The path forward requires sustained commitment. It requires massive investment, not just in mining, but in the entire value chain, from exploration through recycling. It requires international cooperation among countries that don't always see eye to eye on other issues. It requires innovation in materials science, manufacturing processes, and recycling technologies. It requires patience, because building these capabilities takes years, not months. But most fundamentally, it requires recognition of what's at stake. Critical minerals aren't just another commodity. They're the foundation of the modern economy and the backbone of future technologies. The nations and alliances that secure reliable access to these materials will lead. Those that don't will follow, dependent on others for the resources that make advanced economies possible. The competition is on. The clock is ticking, and the outcome is far from certain.